Baldurs Gate 3 is now on all consoles except Switch, so to celebrate this Game of the Year, I've put together all my main guides into one super guide that covers everything a new player needs to know about Baldurs Gate 3 without spoiling anything. Let's go! So the very first decision you'll make is, are you playing as an origin character or a custom character? And this is pretty important because the origin characters make a lot of choices for you in that their race, sub-race, and their class, as well as their background, are all defined for you. You don't actually get to make these decisions. Now, this is a good thing if you are new to D&D or to any of Larian Studios' isometric RPGs, in that it makes that initial decision process a little bit easier for you. They will also come with a background in that you can learn about what their past is and things that will bring up that will definitely happen during the story as these decisions sort of come about themselves. But it is dependent on whether you want that sort of story told to you in that way or whether you want to make a completely custom character. Now, I would suggest to make a custom character if you do want to sort of imprint your own view of the game, whether that be role-playing as your own character or imprinting your own thoughts and feelings. So if you're going to choose a custom character, you can then pick all of these options yourself and really imprint your own views onto the world. The one exception to this is the Dark Urge, in that you can define their race as well as their class into how you like. Now, this can be a mistake if you do choose the Dark Urge and it's not something they actually want to do, because this is definitely a very evil origin, and if you don't want to, I guess, play as a very... Somewhere I'm trying to avoid saying too much about this based on my experience with the Dark Urge, but you will have a constant urge of wanting to cause violence and mayhem, and maybe you don't want to do that, maybe you want to give into those urges, maybe you don't, but it can sometimes be restrictive if you're just trying to have a grand old time and your character is constantly thinking about murdering people and blood. So it's just definitely something to think about if that's not the direction that you want to go. But let's assume that you're going custom here because you want to make your own hero or villain or something in the middle for that purpose here. Your race choice is just as important as in the early access, but for different reasons. So in the early access, all the race's ability score modifiers were tied to the race, whereas now you can actually customize these based on the choice that you want to make yourself. So this gives you the freedom to pick a race based on the looks, if you want to choose a race that way, but also based on either the racial features or the role play, which I think are the two main things to consider, because some of the races, especially let's say the Githyanki, will have a much different role-playing experience because not a lot of people like Githyanki, but also if you come across Githyanki, they will act differently towards you in the game, so it's definitely a big thing to consider. But if you're thinking about it more from a min-maxing perspective, the main thing to consider here with these racial features is the movement speed. So some of these classes, things like the smaller classes, like say the halflings, the dwarves, and the gnomes, have a lower racial movement speed. Now what this means is if they're playing a melee class, like this example here with a barbarian, they will be able to travel a shorter distance, and because you need to get into that melee range to attack enemies, it'll be harder for you to get there. There are ways you can do this, like it's not an end of the world thing, but it's just something to consider if you're considering some sort of a min-max by focusing on those aspects. Another way is to think about if you're playing as a ranged character, whether that be some sort of a rogue or potentially a ranger, depending on the options there. But if you're looking at, say, this option, dark vision is something to consider, because in lots of areas in the game, and I mean like lots more areas than in the early access, there is plenty of dark areas where having characters that have dark vision is so valuable because they can actually see in the dark. You don't have to cast a light, just so you can actually have a higher chance of hitting enemies, which definitely occurs throughout the experience in the game. So paying attention to, say, either the elf, tiefling, drow, dwarf, half elf, or half orc are the main ones to consider here, because these are the races that actually have dark vision. So these are the ones that you want to think about if you're looking at some sort of a ranged option and you want to have dark vision, which definitely makes a difference. But there are other racial features that these classes have if those are the options that you choose to. But picking an option here based on looks or something like that is absolutely something you can do as well. The next decision you'll make is a class. Now, all 12 classes are available now, including the monk. And if you want a full breakdown of the classes, I would highly recommend to check out my classes breakdown video. But just at a high level, it's really up to you what you want to pick here. But as sort of generally very broad strokes here, do you like magic? Then potentially go something like the wizard, the warlock, or the sorcerer. Do you like melee? Then the barbarian, the fighter, and the monk are probably for you. Do you like supporting your team? Well, the paladin, the druid, the cleric, and the bard definitely fit that sort of a bracket. But do you just straight up like animals? Then definitely the druid is for you. Once you've picked your class, the next will be a couple of different choices. Depending on the option here, you'll get some either cantrips or spells or subclass that you'll need to choose from. Now, this is an important decision, but I wouldn't worry too much about making the wrong choice here, as you can always respec your class, you can remake these decisions, and the default options aren't actually that bad either, so it's not too bad. But one thing that I will mention here that is definitely a mistake that you can run into is if you choose the Paladin class. Now, Paladins are a little different in that their subclasses are oaths that they have sworn, and those oaths are actually tied to some of the role-playing aspects of a Paladin. So to sort of simplify this, right, if you're playing as an Oath of the Ancients, you have these tenets that you have to abide by. So you need to show acts of kindness, you need to show love to people, and you need to like bring that sort of forward. Same as in devotion, you need to show courage and compassion and duty, or if you choose vengeance, then you may want to show a little bit of evil towards you and you know, potentially have some sort of wickedness in the world. But those oaths are actually important, because if you break those oaths, you'll get a fourth subclass called the Oathbreaker, which will then change your subclass option. So say if you wanted to play as a good paladin and you know you really like healing radius or something, you make that choice and then you break your oath, that will change your subclass features, which will then in turn change some aspects of your subclass and your class and the way it plays in general, which maybe you didn't actually want to happen. So it's just something that worth mentioning, as it definitely affects the roleplay for the paladin specifically, but some of the other classes are much more freedom based around that. Like, you don't have to follow these directions. And my main that I'm playing as right now is a paladin, so I've definitely been sort of stuck in some of those restrictions where I'm sort of in the game right now. Your background will come into play occasionally in dialogue, but it's mostly important in two specific things: skills and inspiration points. The first being inspiration points. Now, inspiration points are earned by performing actions in the game that align with your background. So for example, say if you are a soldier and you're fighting with a bunch of allies and all the allies survive, you might get an inspiration point for No One Left Behind, and those inspiration points can then later be used to re-roll dice. So if you fail like a specific skill check, you can then use that inspiration point to then say potentially pass that dialogue or skill check, because you get a chance to re-roll that dice. But the skills is definitely one of the important aspects as well, and because there are hundreds of skill checks in the game, like literally hundreds, skills will become a huge factor. So the skill aspect of the background definitely matters, but you will also get to pick some skills based on different decisions as well. Now, every skill in the game has skill checks that you will need to pass or potentially fail if you do fail them, based on different things that happen in the game. Now, just some general things to consider: you want to focus on skills that are relevant to whatever your primary stat or ability point is. So depending on what that is, say in this example, if we are a rogue, then our primary stat is dexterity. We want to lean into the dexterity based skills, because we get additional modifiers for them, not only because we are proficient in that skill, so we get benefits for that, but also because our dexterity is so high that gets added to any of those checks as well. So you definitely want to specialize in that way, but there is options depending on what sort of a class or subclass you pick, or even your background if you want to focus on other things. Some general things to consider is if you want to be a character that talks a lot and wants to sort of immerse themselves in the charismatic aspects of the game, then picking, say, something like a bard that has charisma as their primary stat, and then focusing on those charisma stats like persuasion, performance, intimidation, and deception is an option to go. Say if you want to be super sneaky and steal a bunch of things and maybe do some sort of nefarious actions, then say a rogue with dexterity as their primary stat for things like attributes, sleight of hand, stealth, potentially an option that you may want to go. If you want to interact with things in the world, like move things around, then a character that focuses on strength, say like the barbarian, and then you can have something like the athletic skill, but for the most part, strength will just sort of either impact the athletic skill or just moving things in the world, which you will do sometimes for certain puzzles. You might have to move things around. If you want to find a lot of hidden things in the world, like hidden caches, or say be very perceptive about things that may happen, like hidden buttons, things like that, then something like a cleric, which is main stat is wisdom, may be the option for you for skills like survival, perception, medicine, insight, animal handling, as could be the option that you do pick. If you want to know more about the lore, or essentially just be like significantly smarter than everyone else, which does also, again, like all of these options in my experience have played a part, like actually understanding different characters things in the lore will definitely play a role, then you may want to pick a class that focuses on intelligence like the wizard, and then focus on those skills: arcana, history, investigation, nature, and religion may be the option that you do choose. But also remember that you've got 3 other members of your party that you can specialize in the skills that you don't actually cover, so you've got that option as well. If you're just honestly not sure but you want to just pass every single skill check in the game, the bard is probably the best option, because they have a wide breadth of skills that they can learn, because they get extra skills as they do level up, but also they get jack of all trades, which adds half of their proficiency bonus to any skill checks that they do have to try and pass. And the final option that you'll choose is your ability points. Now, this is definitely an important decision, but you do get to assign those bonuses. So something that I will mention here is, depending on the options you pick, it's important to try and get all of your abilities to be an even number. Why this is important is because you don't actually gain benefits from a stat being on an odd number. For example, here, if our constitution is on 13, our overall HP is still 14, and we're not actually gaining anything from it. Whereas if we go to 14, it also increases all of those aspects, and our health is now 15. So having everything on a positive number is the main thing you should try and focus on. It's not, the biggest deal if you don't actually get that, but it's just something to think about as you're trying to either apply these points and then apply these modifiers. Obviously focus on whichever one has the star, as that's your primary ability, but some classes like the paladin may actually have a spell casting modifier that's different to whatever their primary stat is, right? As a paladin, you want to be swinging a melee weapon, so your strength is important, but their spell casting modifier is charisma, so you definitely want to have a high amount of charisma as a paladin. So just make sure that you check what your class's spell casting modifier is, as it'll either be intelligence, wisdom, or charisma, and make sure that you've applied that depending on your class option, as well as thinking about dexterity, because that is linked to your armor class. But otherwise, just using the recommended you can't go wrong with, as it will definitely point you in the right direction for whatever your class's general specifics are. We'll start with some world exploration stuff. Now, the world is filled with secrets, and this also means that your character is going to make a lot of skill checks. Now, anytime you see your character make a skill check, there is going to be something there. Like, if you fail the skill check, you know that there was something there. Everyone in your party can actually make that same skill check, so you can always change the people that you have with you if everyone else failed, and then they can potentially pass that check, so you can actually see what's there, whether it be a chest or a trap or a burrow hole or something else entirely. Now, you will only ever roll a dice next to a chest if that chest is trapped or if it's a mimic. So if everyone in your party fails a perception check the moment you walk up next to a chest, you know that it's going to be trapped, even if you can't actually disarm it because you didn't pass the perception check. But if you do pass the check, you can obviously disarm it. If you don't, you can move your party away from it and then just have one person there and sacrifice them to the trap, so you can still get what's actually in there. Now, all of these skills and everything are sort of relevant to something in the world. So strength allows you to move objects, which is really useful for certain puzzles. Dexterity skills like sleight of hand are used for like lockpicking and stealth. Wisdom is used for like perception, survival, finding things in the world like hidden chests and like burrows. Intelligence is mostly used in conversations and understanding different elements of lore, or getting more information about things, like racking your brain to see, oh, I totally remember about this random character from X, or this sort of a thing. Like it definitely comes into play in that way. The map is filled with a lot of burrow holes and tiny crevices that larger creatures can't fit into. So having a druid in your party that can wild shape it, or a smaller character like a halfling or a gnome or something that can fit in some of these crevices, is absolutely worth doing. Now, if you don't have a druid or you don't want to play as a druid, you can just summon one from withers as a hireling and then have them wild shape into a cat or those sort of smaller creatures. So you can still do those things if you want to, and then just dismiss the companion afterwards and just like leave them at your camp and only use them for those times you need it. But druids and essentially the hirelings in general are a great way to get access to different spells or different mechanics that you don't necessarily have as part of your core party. Like using the druid example again, you can teach them fly to access like high areas. But I will say, even with this sort of mechanic, that you will miss content. You will make certain choices, you will fail skill checks. It's just part of the journey. Like lean into it, embrace the chaos, and have fun. New to the full game is alchemy, which is a massive buff to your overall effectiveness inside and outside of combat. So all over the world now, you'll find ingredients that you can use to craft various things in the alchemy menu. Now, the most common thing that you'll craft here is definitely going to be healing potions, and the purpose of those is pretty obvious. obvious to what they sort of give you in terms of buffs, but there are other benefits as well, not only in terms of potions, like being able to say, you know, animal speaking, but you've got elixirs, which are potions, sort of like potions, I guess, that you can take, which will give you various buffs. I like the bark skin potion here because essentially, or elixir, sorry, essentially what you can do with this is on something like a mage character, you can have them consume this and it will increase their armor class to 16 until the next long rest. So if you're, say, running Gale, or you yourself are a mage character, it increases your armor class so you avoid getting hit more often. Grenades can be thrown at enemies to deal some AoE damage, and then you've got coatings as well that you can put on your weapons, so you can either coat them in poison to deal extra damage, or you could coat them in things like Oil of Accuracy to give you a higher chance of hitting with increasing your overall attack roll. But most of these actions that come from these alchemy potions are actually bonus actions. So if in combat you have a character that, say, doesn't really have a way to use their bonus action every single combat turn, maybe something like a barbarian or something like that, that's mostly just going to attack with their action and then not really use their bonus action, having these options to say, you know, coat your weapon in oil or do something like that is really beneficial into combat, just so you're not wasting those actions, but also to give you benefits in combat as well, which is definitely well worth having. By the way, the Baldurs Gate 3 community wiki, BG3.wiki, is a great resource for things like this and any other sort of information that you may be looking for. They've got plenty of good stuff on there. So moving on to Withers and the Hirelings and respecking. Now, Withers can respec your class in the full game. Just by talking to him, you can ask him that you need to change class. You don't actually have to change your class here. Just by doing this and using up that 100 gold cost, it seems like it's always 100 gold based on my experience, but you can then just pick the same class and same ability points and everything, but you can then just go through the leveling process again. So if you wanted to change something, like if you want to change a feat that you chose or something like that, you can do that, but you can change your class in that way as well. But you can also hire hirelings from Withers. Now, these are just like other people that you can hire that don't have backstories or really care about what's happening in the world. They're essentially just like party members that will fight for you in combat, and there's one of these for each of the classes, which helps, like we mentioned with that druid example earlier. If you need someone to, say, talk to animals or get into crevices, or you just want to help in that regard, then you can definitely do that. But you get Withers from a location very early in the game called the Dank Crypt, just near the Overgrown Ruins. You will see this very, very early in the game. You need to go down here and you'll be able to perceive a button, press the button, open the crypt, and Withers is inside that crypt. Now, you will, if you don't do this, he will pop up at your camp at a later point as well, but it's just worth pointing out, like, if you want to get him earlier, and also just to make sure you have him, is to go and do this. This is super early in the game, so it's not like a massive spoiler if you just go here and grab him for your party. Let's go through some quick combat stuff to make sure that you're covered across all of the things that happen in Baldurs Gate 3, which is a little different to other games. Now, firstly, something that if you aren't sure what's happening, or say something happens you're not sure, you can click the little option on the bottom right hand side to bring up like the combat log, and you can then hover over anything like attack rolls, damage rolls, saving throws, and all the other nonsense that happens in the game, just so you can kind of keep up with what's going on, because there's going to be a lot of saving throws and critical hits and misses and various things and statuses and stuff that's like being thrown around, and it's sometimes hard to keep up with. Now, what you will need to know about attacking in Baldurs Gate 3 is, just like in D&D, two things happen. You have attack rolls and then damage rolls. The first that happens is the attack roll. Now, this will roll a 1d20 plus any modifiers that you may have against the target's armor class. Now, if you roll above that armor class, the attack will hit. If you roll below it, the attack will miss, and it may critically miss if it rolls a 1, or critically hit if it rolls a 20. Now, after that point, then you'll roll the damage dice. Now, the damage dice will actually determine how much damage that effect actually does. So when you're looking at any weapon that you may have, it'll always say like 1d6 or 1d8 plus whatever types of bludgeoning or slashing or what have you sort of damage, and it's the same for spells as well. On top of this, there are saving throws. Now, anytime certain effects or spells are used against you, a saving throw will be made. Now, depending on the type of spell, it will be a saving throw based on an ability. It could be wisdom, intelligence, what have you, and then you'll either pass or fail that based on that spell and the parameters, and then if you fail it, you'll take those effects. If you save against that, then you'll pass those effects. It's the same as if you walk into like a poison cloud or something like that. You'll see these saving throws throw up as well. A couple of other combat things. I highly recommend that you examine enemies whenever you face them. Enemies, especially like higher level enemies or enemies of all sorts of different types, will have unique resistances. So paying attention to those resistances, whether it be slashing, bludgeoning damage, or even certain types of magic, will help you determine what type of effects are actually better to be used against that target, because it will definitely come into play. Like, I've had it many times that I've used like a fire spell and then realized, oh great, you know, like I've just hit fire on something that's immune to fire, I've wasted my action. So definitely be considerate of checking what enemies are actually efficient against. And stealth is just as OP as it was in the early access. Stealth attacks obviously have advantage. A rogue like Astarion actually having stealth attacks will gain like heaps of damage from that. So just paying attention, especially if you're like thinking, oh, you know, maybe this encounter is going to end up in combat. You can use the character select to switch to a different character, line them up and say stealth them a little bit further away. So then if the combat doesn't like start, then you can sort of walk up on your own and actually have them engage the encounter and get that first initial strike before the real combat actually breaks out. Now, there's a couple of things to consider when making a party. There's obviously combat, and the other side of things is the social aspects of Baldur's Gate 3, which is a core part of the role-playing experience. So we're going to talk about mostly combat here, but this is going to be a bit of an introductory video to a little bit of a series that we're going to do breaking down some of the different roles in Baldur's Gate 3, but I wanted to talk about social first. Now, social is important because in Baldur's Gate 3 and D&D as well, the role-play aspect and the skills are a huge part of the game. And, you know, a clear example of this, right, just to simplify things, is the charisma skill in dialogue and being able to persuade enemies with the persuasion skill. Now, if you are proficient in persuasion, you'll get a proficiency bonus to add to the dice roll along with your charisma modifier. So this will happen for all skill checks, right? So you'll always get a modifier added based on the ability that it's actually using. And then if you're proficient in the skill it's using, you'll get another bonus on top of that. So when that comes to like the social aspects, really, you sort of want a relatively good breadth of skills covered by your party. Now, you could essentially go and try and like min-max and cover every single skill in the game, which is probably possible, but there is some fun in failing. So, you know, not always passing every check. You know, you obviously want to be proficient in some things and succeed in some ways, but sometimes it's okay to fail. And I think that in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, it's actually a lot of fun in, say, maybe your main talker who's going to be in all conversations has like 0 charisma and is a bumbling idiot. You know, it sounds like a good time in a way. But when you're thinking about these checks, you want to have someone in your party that is proficient in the dexterity skills, potentially someone who's proficient in the intelligence and wisdom skills, and then definitely someone who's proficient in the charisma skills. Now, you can break this out in different ways. Like you can say just have a rogue like Astarion, just know all the dexterity skills and focus on all the dexterity stuff. You can have a wizard like Gale, focus on all the intelligence things, or you can just have a character that's sort of a breadth across the board. But something that I would consider when making a party is having some sort of a main talker, someone with the charisma skills that you can use for, say, persuasion or intimidation, those sort of things. Then someone with the dexterity based skills, someone that can lockpick or has sleight of hand is really important. And then someone that will cover, say, the intelligence and wisdom skills sort of in your last sort of 2 characters. But there are other ways to buff yourself as well. Like there are skills that can increase your chance of getting a success on a roll, or even Animal Whisperer, which is a great skill so that you can actually talk to animals. So there is different ways that you can think about this, but just sort of broadly speaking, you want to think about those skills and trying to cover as many as possible. And I guess another point as well is the approval ratings with your companions, because the companions in the game will have approval ratings based on what you, the player character, do. So obviously if they don't like you, they can leave your party or potentially even attack you. So that's worth thinking about. But you can obviously just have hirelings as well that you can hire instead, so they don't actually have any sort of ratings towards you. But the main crux of this video and of the reason to have a party composition is for actual combat. Now, a couple of tips before we get into the nitty gritty. Ranged combat is very advantageous in Baldur's Gate 3, as many combat encounters are spread out, and mages and sort of ranged characters using bows and crossbows have a huge advantage because they can actually attack from range and just immediately start attacking enemies at the start of combat. Generally speaking as well, I would try and avoid having 2 characters that are of the same class or using the same equipment types. Say if you've got 2 people that are using greatswords and you find this amazing greatsword, who will you give it to? You know, there are plenty of different weapon options and spell options and different sort of setups in Baldur's Gate 3 that you shouldn't really be having characters use the same sort of weapons unless you're specifically going for some sort of bombastic build. So generally speaking, talking about party composition, you want to have a mix of classes and archetypes that fill different roles in combat encounters. What I mean by that is you want to have a character, let's say a tank. Now this would be a high hit point and a high armor class character. Armor class is determined by the character's dexterity as well as the armor they're wearing, and anytime a character attacks that character, they have to roll an attack dice, which is then compared to the armor class of that character. So the higher the armor class, the less chance they'll get hit. But then if they do get hit, they have a higher chance of surviving that hit, right? Because they've got a higher amount of health. So it fits sort of like a tank archetype, but not necessarily a tank. It doesn't have to be specifically, but a melee character is definitely the focus there. Now, generally, the classes that fit that sort of a mold is a fighter, a barbarian, and a paladin, because they have good armor proficiencies, other than the barbarian that gets unarmored defense as an alternative, but they have good armor proficiencies so they can wear armor, have that higher armor class, and take some of those hits with their higher health pool. A monk could also fit this role as well because they are typically melee focused with unarmored combat. Companion wise, you've got Lazil as a fighter and Karlak as a barbarian that can fill this role for you as part of the companion party members that can join your team. The second role is a sort of support healer / buffer. Now this can be either melee or ranged, but the role of this role, I guess, is to be a support character. Now that doesn't necessarily always mean healing your party members when they are low on health, as there are other ways to do that, but the main focus here as well is on buffing and debuffing enemies. Buffing yourself and debuffing enemies is a huge part of D&D and also Baldurs Gate. It's actually more beneficial than you may realize, because if you say debuff your enemy with something like Bane or give them disadvantage on their attack roll, it essentially means they have to roll 2 dice and take the lowest figure of that dice and then compare it to the armor class of the character that they're attacking. So you've got a extra chance of avoiding that damage, right? And vice versa, say if you're using a way to buff your characters and increase their chance of hitting by like adding extra dice to their attack rolls or advantage, that sort of a thing, then you are giving yourself a more guaranteed way to deal damage. It's a very important part of D&D and Baldur's Gate 3 in general, so it's worth considering. Now, this is really filled by a couple of different classes. So you've got the cleric that can fill this role, you've got a druid, especially a Circle of Land druid that can fill this role, bards with their bardic inspiration and other spells can absolutely fill this role, and then there's some other options as well depending on the way that you build them, like paladins and rangers and that sort of a thing. But for the most part, this role is filled by someone that can do some spell casting to heal and do the debuffs and buffs. But in terms of companions, this is currently only really fillable by Shadowheart as a cleric. She can fill the healing role plus the buffing and debuffing, though the chances is that Halsin the druid may also be a companion in the full version of the game, so if they can, they probably can. It's also worth mentioning as well that chances are there are going to be more companions that we don't necessarily know about, like maybe 1 or 2 secret ones, so maybe there's more when the full game comes out, but obviously at this stage we don't rightly know. Moving on to the ranged damage dealer. Now typically this will be some sort of a mage character, but you could also absolutely run some sort of a martial based with a crossbow, that sort of a thing, character as well. But essentially this role is like an all-out, not necessarily glass cannon, but definitely a high damage dealer from range. This, in terms of classes, can be covered by the warlock, the wizard, and the sorcerer, typically as your mage-based ones with a lot of cantrips that can deal damage, as well as spell slots that they can use to do damage from range. And then in the martial way, you've got things like a ranger, a rogue, or potentially a fighter if you choose to specialize in archery. But those are the sort of the key ones that you've got that you can look for this sort of a role. Now, this isn't a requirement to have a role like this, but it is absolutely worth doing because of how beneficial ranged combat is, like I mentioned earlier in Baldur's Gate 3, because of these massive arenas that have these huge landscapes as well as a lot of verticality, and when you're up on high ground you can get advantage on some of those attack rolls, so it's absolutely worth considering having someone like this in your party. In terms of your companions, you've got Gale that fills this role as a wizard, you've got Will that fills this role as a warlock, and Astarion can fill this role as well as a rogue if you want to keep him on sort of a ranged basis, but there's plenty of options that you can sort of fit there. Now, other than those 3 as the main primary, I personally think that this 4th slot is like a personal preference flex slot. And what I mean by that is you can sort of fill this role with anything that's sort of fun to you, and I think that this fits where your player character can go if you don't want to specifically have your player character as either sort of the tanky or the healery or the ranged damage dealer. You can just sort of have them as a fun character that can do anything and everything or something in between that sort of fits neatly into this role. Now, if you don't necessarily want that, like if you want to know what I would suggest to have as that 4th slot, I would either be looking to have the other alternative. Say is your ranged damage dealer, you've got a mage, you could have some sort of a melee rogue that can deal damage sort of from a stealthy position, or you could even just have another ranged martial dealer, like say having a ranger that can deal damage from range with a bow, specializing in the hunter aspects of that kit, and then having the mage specialize in the spells from range gives you that flexibility. Or you could just have 2 melee fighters, you know, something like that. But I'll also give you some examples of some like general party setup. So if you want to play like a support role, let's say a bard, because bards are great talkers because of their high charisma, as well as their great skills and jack of all trades skill that they can get as well. Let's say say you're playing a Bard as a support character, you can then run Lazil as your tank setup. You've got Astarion as a rogue playing that sort of flex role, and then you've got Gale as the mage damage dealer. Another alternative is if you want to play as a melee barbarian or fighter or paladin or something in between, you could then play that sort of a tanky role. You could bring Shadowheart along with you to play that support role. And then in this example, you could run Will as a flex damage dealer that can do a little bit of melee, but mostly focuses on spells. And then you've got Gale as well as your wizard damage, or you could then switch out either Will or Gale for Astarion or something in that sort of flex position. But I hope that helps you think about your party composition in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I will also say that based on subclasses and specific ways you can build out these classes and even multi-classing, these classes that I'm giving you as these specific like archetypes and roles aren't necessarily going to fit that role. Like you can build them out in different ways if you so choose to, right? You know, there's nothing stopping you from using the wizard's quarterstaff to just melee enemies all the time, right? Like if you want to make a melee wizard, you could do that and just whack people in the face with a staff. Like there's no worries that you could do that, or you can multi-class them into different ways, right? There's a lot of flexibility there, but I just wanted to give you sort of a broad overview of things to consider when building out your party. I've just updated my membership program here on YouTube to include early access to practically every video. So if you like these sort of builds or any of the other content that I do on the channel, consider joining the membership. Costs you literally $1. You get early access to basically every video, plus access to the members only Discord, a bunch of other benefits as well. So if you like what I do here, please consider checking that out. But enough of that, onto the video. So firstly, I want to talk about proficiencies, especially armor proficiencies, and a couple of other things you need to be aware of. So generally, proficiencies aren't all built the same. And in terms of armor, what I mean by that is even if you have characters that may be proficient in medium armor or heavy armor, it's often not the best case for them to wear. The best example of this is obviously the Barbarian with their unarmored defense. When you're not wearing armor, you can add your Constitution modifier to your armor class, but there are several other things that you need to consider. So the main reason that you're wearing armor or should be wearing armor is because of your armor class. And what this does is that anytime a particular roll is made, that attack roll will then be compared with the character's armor class to determine whether that attack hits or not. So obviously the higher your character's armor class is, the better, because they have a higher chance of avoiding any damage coming towards them. But that isn't necessarily just increased by wearing light or heavy armor or what have you and just putting on that armor. In a lot of cases, you don't want to do that. So something to consider here is that the different types of armor. So firstly, there is clothing, which is essentially no armor. And for characters that are in this sort of category, they have the base armor class of 10 plus their dexterity modifier, whatever that is. For most of these characters, this is going to be sort of your spellcasters and that sort of a thing that will increase their armor class via other methods. That could be via the elixir of bark skin or by mage armor, what have you. Light armor is that next level up, and this will have the armor class of the stated piece on the armor plus whatever your dexterity modifier is. So any character that has a high dexterity, say for example Astarion as a rogue, or any character that uses dexterity as one of their primary modifiers, light armor is the best option, especially if you can get your dexterity up to say 20 and give yourself a +5 in that category. Medium armor is similar to light armor, except that dexterity modifier is capped at 2. So using Astarion as an example again, he shouldn't be wearing medium armor, even though maybe you have a rogue or something that is proficient in it, because their dex modifier is capped at 2. So essentially it's actually less armor class because you're not actually gaining as many benefits. Say the medium armor might initially have like a base armor class of 13, and that light armor might only have a base armor class of 12, but it's actually going to be less because the dex modifier is capped at 2. So it's worth considering that when you're looking at the armor. And the next level on top of that is heavy, which gives you no dexterity modifier for that armor. You only get whatever that armor's actual rating is. If you're wearing heavy armor, you want to increase that armor class even further. You can equip something like a shield as a way to do that. And you can also do this on characters that don't wear armor as well. If they are proficient in shields, you can whack one on because it doesn't technically count as armor, and they'll just get a +2 or a +3 to their armor class depending on the shield. Now this also relates to weapon usage. A lot of classes and characters in the game will have simple or martial weapons and have access to basically all the weapons that they, are available in the game. But in some cases, there are weapons that they shouldn't be using because they're not finesse weapons. Now, what a finesse weapon is it will use either your strength or dexterity modifier when attacking with that weapon, and whatever is higher. So in some cases, you may look at a weapon and it'd be like, oh, you know, its damage is 2 to 9, and this one's is say 2 to 7, but ultimately the one that's 2 to 7 may actually work out to be more damage because it's a finesse weapon and that character has a higher dexterity than they do strength, whereas the 2 to 9 weapon is actually a strength weapon. So also consider that when you're looking at those different weapons and your different proficiencies. The last thing I'll say about this as well is that even though some characters, say mages and everything, can actually wear armor, even if they're not proficient, you can't actually cast spells when you are wearing armor you're not proficient in, so just be mindful of. Moving on to number 2 is that your allies need work. You should be respecking them in most cases. Now, when Withers shows up at your camp, either he will just randomly show up one day, or you can free him in the crypts in the first act, which I'll show where that is right here. But essentially, when you go to Withers, you can actually ask him to respec your class. Now, you don't actually have to change your class here. What we're really interested in is the last option in the menu, which is your ability points. A really good example of why you need to do this is Astarion. Now, if you don't want to build Astarion as a arcane trickster, like personally I didn't want to, he has a bunch of wasted points into intelligence, so you can actually get rid of those points and put them into something useful like dexterity or constitution that he's actually going to use. It's also worth pointing out here as well that on this screen you can actually change their skills. So say if you're using a certain, 3 companions that have a little bit of skill overlap, and whether that's with yourself or even just with your other companions, you can use this menu to change their skills as well that they're proficient in, so then you don't have that initial overlap, and you're not, say, using Astarion as an example again. I love Astarion, right? Like, I'm not hating on the boy, he's great, but he has a bunch of skill proficiencies into the charisma skills, which, if you're not playing as Astarion and he's not going to be your main talker, it's sort of a waste, and you can move those points to something else that maybe you don't actually have coverage of to sort of better fit your party in terms of a min-max perspective better. Also, while we're talking about Withers, you can actually hire hirelings from Withers as well. So when you're here, essentially you can hire a hireling of any class. If you don't want to use the companions, or you want a different sort of a class in your party, you can do that as well. And the hirelings can be completely respec'd as well, so you can change their class and all of that stuff as well. Reactions are amazing, and you should be ticking the ask option for basically all of your reactions. So every combat turn, you have an action, a bonus action, and a reaction. Now, the reaction system in Baldurs Gate 3 is a little bit hidden in that in some cases things will just happen. If you don't play around with this menu at all, you may just initiate an opportunity attack or something without even realizing and wasting that action, or maybe not wasting that action, because sometimes those effects can actually be useful. But in some cases, using my paladin as an example, I have a ton of different reaction options, and there's a chance that maybe I want to save my reaction for a specific action that is occurring. You'll see when looking at the reactions that they say they recharge once per turn, but there are some reactions, like say Reckless Attack, that don't actually recharge once per turn. It's just an effect that is triggered as long as you can actually trigger that effect. So by ticking the ask, it will tell you when it does have the option to trigger, and then you'll be able to trigger it. You can then make sure that before that reaction just actually triggers, you can make sure whether you actually want to use it or not, whether you want to react or not. This information, even just by ticking this, even if you want those reactions to go through, it actually gives you a ton of valuable information that you wouldn't get beforehand. Using Counterspell as an example, Counterspell is a reaction spell that anytime a caster casts a spell within your radius, you can counter that spell as a reaction to cancel out its effects. Now, essentially, you may not want to do this every time that this happens, but just by enabling this ask option, if you do have a spell slot and a reaction available, it will ask you if you want to counter it. So it will tell you that this character is casting this spell and it hasn't gone off yet, so you can decide whether you want to react to that or not. The same thing happens with, say, Defensive Duelist, one of the feats, that when a character makes an attack on you while you're holding a finesse weapon in your main hand and nothing in your offhand, you can choose whether to react to that to increase your armor class by 2. So in the same way, if someone makes that roll on you and say that's going to hit, like their attack roll was, say, 17, but you've only got a 15 armor class, by adding that +2, you'll get 17, the attack will miss, but maybe they rolled a 20 and you're adding that +2 won't actually do anything for you. You can sort of avoid that from actually happening. So there's plenty of reasons to tick these options. There's also a ton of gear in the game that will add reactions to your characters, like defensive snaring or something like that. So reactions, really, really important, can make such a difference, giving you valuable information for the encounter, allowing you to act while it's not your turn, which is just like a huge buff in any regards, and it's just a really valuable thing to do. Backgrounds are more important than you think. They give you experience and inspiration points. So when you're picking a background, now I've been saying this for basically all of my class guides, that you should sort of pick based on the roleplay elements, and I still stand by that, but something to consider here is that you may have noticed in the full game, which was different to the early access, is that some characters will like out level others. Like some characters may level up first before others will, and this is because of the inspiration system. So when you do certain actions in the game, you may actually get an inspiration point. This will also come with some experience, but if you have 4 inspiration points, which is the maximum, that extra point will just be turned into straight XP for that character specifically. So in some cases, you may notice that some characters have slightly more XP than others. Now in the inspiration menu here, you can actually see what the backgrounds of all the characters are and what you've actually got inspiration points from. It's also worth noting that when you've got 4 inspiration points, you should definitely use up at least one of them. By any like skill check that you come across, you can actually use an inspiration point to re-roll that dice, and you will get heaps of inspiration points. Like they come pretty thick and fast, like just as you're doing, that sounds dirty, but they come pretty often when you're just like doing things. So just pay attention to when you've got that 4, that you use 1 or 2 of them so you can actually get the next ones, unless you want it to go to your experience for that character. But in most cases, that inspiration point to sort of save you from a dice roll that you definitely don't want to fail is definitely worth doing. Gold is great, but what about free gold and free items? So I wanted to cover this because I've seen some questions with a lot of, you know, my friends and stuff that like they're streaming, they're like, what do we sell? Like, can you just like sell anything? And I mean, for the most part, yeah, you can sell like anything. Most of the items that are linked to any sort of story things or anything like that, they will tell you when you pick up that item. Like your character will be like, hey, I should, you know, hold on to this or whatever. So anything that doesn't happen for, you can get rid of. That's like any bottles and cans and what have you, any of the general clutter you find, gems, weapons, armor, all of that stuff that you don't want, you can sell all of that. Start with the best cantrips, and we're going to start out with the best cantrip in the game, and that is Eldritch Blast. Now, Eldritch Blast allows you to deal 1d10 damage of force damage to targets, and at level 5 you gain an extra beam, and 11 you gain an extra beam as well. So it essentially becomes sort of like a mini magic missile in a way, because it gets the extra beams, and as a warlock you can add your charisma modifier to these beams as well as other effects based on the decisions you make as you're leveling up. So Eldritch Blast can be cast as many times as you like because it doesn't require a spell slot, and it can essentially do up to just like 20 damage if you crit with it with a roll on a 10, or even 30 once you hit to like level 11. That's not including any of the charisma modifiers or any other modifiers like that. It's a fantastic cantrip for warlocks and any other class if you wanted to spec into this, say with your feats or something like that. Next is Vicious Mockery, which is a bard focused cantrip which deals 1d4 damage of psychic damage, which isn't the main reason you want to use this. It's more for receiving the disadvantage on attack rolls that a targets get if it passes its check. Now this is great for, say, just using this basically on every turn on targets that, you know, maybe they are, you know, a high damage target that, let's say, a boss or something, and you want to avoid taking damage from them. Having them have disadvantage on their attack rolls is huge. It's also beneficial to, say, counteract the reckless attack of a barbarian like Karlach for something like that. Shillelagh will imbue your staff or club with nature's power, giving it an additional 1d8 plus wisdom modifier of bludgeoning damage to the attack rolls. This is also a bonus action, so you can cast this and then use your action to attack in the same turn just for that extra damage that you get off from it. So it's really valuable in that regard. And just like some solid fallback options, like especially for the wizard, Firebolt, Ray of Frost are both pretty okay. Ray of Frost probably gets a little bit of an edge because it lowers the target's movement speed, though Firebolt often does a little bit more damage, but that's sort of up to you if you're looking for just some fallback options. The best offensive spells we'll talk about now, and Chromatic Orb is definitely a must-have. Now, this can often seem misleading because it just says it'll either do thunder damage or you can pick the damage type, and the damage amounts aren't that high. You can upcast it with a higher spell slot, but the real reason that this is good is actually because it can allow you to avoid enemy resistances, because you can cast it as any elemental type. So say that the target is immune to acid damage, right? It's got high resistance, then you could cast Chromatic Orb as fire, or it's immune to thunder and you can cast it as cold, what have you, right? It gives you that elemental damage type flexibility, and it creates a surface on the ground. So say, for example, if you throw some grease down, put some fire on there, you can then blow up that fire, or you could even use cold to create some sort of like ice on the ground that enemies could slip on. Moving on to Magic Missile, this is again a staple for any of these casting classes. Now this will send out darts of magical force that will deal force damage to the targets depending on how many projectiles you put out, and if you upcast it there's more projectiles, and this will always hit. The damage will obviously be different depending on the role, but you cannot miss with Magic Missile. That's what makes it so strong. Cloud of Daggers is a great area denial spell that will conjure a cloud of spinning daggers that lasts for 10 turns, and anyone that is inside the whirlwind will take 4d4 slashing damage each turn while they're in that area. So say if you can set up like a choke point and put this down and then have everyone sort of like walk through it or even just stand in it, it'll deal heaps of damage. Moonbeam functions basically exactly the same as that, except with Moonbeam it's a bit more damage as it's a 2d10s, and you can actually move Moonbeam. It's a druid spell, so it's a little bit harder to get, say if you wanted to go down that route, but Moonbeam is also a fantastic option, and even if the target passes its save, it'll still take half of its damage. Fireball is my favorite spell, and that's all I want to say about that. No, but it's like Fireball is like a big AoE spell. It deals an insane amount of damage if you buff it in various ways, which we talked about in the Wizard video. It can do heaps of damage, and it is great, and I like blowing things up with Fireball. Okay, moving on. Ice Storm is also good. Now, Ice Storm is sort of like the ice variant of Fireball. Ice will crash down and deal damage. It'll also create an ice effect on the ground that enemies can slip on. And defensive spells. Now, these are a little bit like harder to sort of cover because there's not heaps of them, right? Like you've got the healing spells like Healing Word, which will allow you to heal a target. Now, this won't heal the target for heaps, but it's better than Cure Wounds, as Cure Wounds is a melee spell, so you have to be in melee range, and not all of your, say, support characters will be in melee range, so Healing Word gets the sort of the value there a little bit more. You've also got Bane, which is probably one of the best defensive spells, as you can target up to 3 creatures and give them a 1d4 penalty to attack rolls and saving throws. So a little bit like how earlier we were discussing Vicious Mockery, how it gives disadvantage on attack rolls. This operates in a similar way in that it lowers the target's attack rolls, so hopefully there's a more chance that they will hit. Aid is also great to bolster your allies, to give them not only health but also increase their hit point maximum. So you can do this, say, before a fight starts, increase their overall hit points, so then you've got more health that they have, you've got more health to heal. Shield of Faith increases one character's armor class by 2. Anytime you can do this is also valuable, because the higher the armor class, the less chance they are of being hit by those attack rolls. Let's say you've casted Shield of Faith on a character, and then another one of your characters has casted Bane on another. Not only are they going to have a lower penalty to their attack rolls, they're also going to have a higher armor class, so they're even harder to hit. And then Mass Healing Word is also worth calling out, as it's just like Healing Word, except it hits everyone. Utility spells is a category that I'm sort of like including things that don't fit in these other categories. We'll start with Mage Armor, which will increase the target's armor class, and you should absolutely be using this on any of your spellcasters, like after every long rest. It lasts until the next long rest and is absolutely fantastic. Command is also great. Now, Command isn't as useful in combat. Like, you can obviously make enemies flee or grovel on the ground or something like that, but the reason it's great is because you can make any enemy drop their weapon and you can steal it. So let's say there is a particular person that may have some sort of a legendary sword, or maybe there are other people in the game that have incredible weapons and you only have a limited amount of time to get them. You can just tell them to drop that sword and pick it up, and away you go. Misty Step is also great. Now, Misty Step, as a bonus action, you can move to an area that you can see. And this is great to not only avoid damage. Let's say someone's coming towards your caster and you want to like Misty Step to another location, but you can actually use it to get in range. Like if you want to locate yourself at like a certain high ground away from targets, you can use it for that as well. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a great control spell that will make creatures lay on the ground prone and essentially laugh. I prefer this to some of the other control spells, as it's easier to get off and it doesn't require like the target to have a certain amount of like health pool. Say for example, like sleep. C, invisibility, is super useful for actually seeing creatures that are invisible. This actually happens more than you will think in Baldur's Gate 3, so just having this as an option so you can see creatures when they turn invisible is important. And also the invisibility spell can also help with, say, your stealthy boys, so they can either steal stuff or actually get themselves in certain positions. Counterspell is incredible, and you should always have counterspell. So this will allow you to, as a reaction, interrupt a creature's spell. Now, what's not only benefit about this is because you can just cancel out their spell, it gives you information. So when they're, say, casting their spell, before that actual effect happens, you can see what they're casting, because it will tell you and make the decision as if you want to counter it or just let it go through, right? So if they're casting some big, massive spell that you really need to avoid, you can counter it, get rid of it, and then you can move on. Or if it's just like, you know, some piddly little ray of frost, you don't have to worry about it. Polymorph transforms a creature into a harmless sheep for a limited amount of time. This is great to get a character that is maybe a little bit stronger or larger, or just generally like a bigger threat, like how we were talking about Vicious Mockery before. You can get that creature out of the encounter for a period of time. And the last couple I'll mention is Conjure Minor Element and Element. It's great to just have some sort of a summon like this to not only take hits for you, but also deal damage out, especially if you've got a party that doesn't have a lot of like tanks in it. And Heat Metal as a druid spell is incredible. So practically every enemy, like most enemies in the game, except for certain like creatures and monstrosities, will be holding a metal weapon. You can heat up that bad boy so that they take fire damage, and they also have a chance to drop it, which is also incredible. Again, just like command drop, you could just go and steal that weapon if you want, or it also just stops them from attacking with that weapon for a period of time. Guidance is also an incredible cantrip that can be added to almost any ability check, and it just gives you a straight 1d4 bonus. So if you just need that little bit extra on top of whatever you're trying to do here, you're going to add that bonus, and then it will give you that a bit extra to hopefully hit that ability check. Picking the best feat. So it's very dependent on your build and your class and what you're overall focusing on. And what I decided to do for this video, so we can sort of cover everything in the one video, was break it down into the major archetypes. So melee martial, so melee characters that use martial weapons; ranged martial, so ranged characters that use like bows and crossbows; and general spellcasters. Now, if you have picked a feat that you're not happy with, you can just pay the respect cost to Withers of 100 gold, then just pick the same class and it will reset you back to level 1, so you can go through that leveling process again, and then at level 4 and 8 and so on, you can actually just change your feats again. So let's generally talk about the best option for every single class, regardless of your class, and that is really just the ability improvement. What this does, it will increase one of your ability score by 2, or 2 of your ability scores by 1. Across the board, this is typically going to be one of your feats if you don't replace it with something else that also gives you an ability pour into your primary stat. So the main reason you do this is because in character creation, you can only get your primary stat to 17 regardless of what you do, and getting it to 18 will then give you an additional modifier, because with all of your ability points, you only actually gain benefits from the even numbers rather than the odd. This is the same for any melee characters that might be using strength modifiers for their weapons, or even spellcasters that might be using intelligence, wisdom, or charisma for their spellcasting modifier. So getting it to that next even number is actually really important. Now, in some cases, you might not actually need 2 ability scores, right? Getting 2 might actually be overkill because everything's on even except for the 1 actual ability point that you need. So what you could do in that case is pick up one of the other feats that only give you, say, 1 ability point and some other benefit. A good example here might be like athlete. So you can increase your strength or dexterity by 1. So you could then say use this to push your dexterity to 18 or strength to 18. But then when you are prone, standing up uses less movement, and your jump distance is also increased by 50%. So you still get the benefits of getting it to that positive number, but then you get an additional benefit rather than wasting that extra ability score into something else. But there is a couple of these options sort of throughout the feats. Like Resilient is another one. You just will increase 1 ability by 1, and then you also gain proficiency in that ability saving throws, which is always a solid option as well. So across the board, you're probably going to pick up this ability point improvement or something similar for basically every class. It'll either be like the first feat you pick up, or maybe the second or something like that, but you'll definitely want to grab this or one of the other options in this category as one of your main feats. And now we'll move on to the more specific stuff. So we'll start with the melee martial. Now, I think the most consistent, or say like best overall option for a sort of melee character is definitely Savage Attacker. So when making weapon attacks, you roll your damage dice twice and use the highest result. So you can't go wrong with getting essentially advantage on that actual damage roll and getting the highest amount of damage out of that. I've definitely noticed with my Barbarian that getting those massive attack rolls makes a huge difference. I would also consider picking up something that maybe is more specific to, say, the weapon that you're using, something like Defensive Duelist. So when you're attacked with a melee attack while wielding a finesse weapon that you're proficient in, you can use your reaction to increase your armor class, or say Dual Wielder. So you can use 2 weapon fighting if your weapons aren't light, and you also gain 1 bonus to your armor class. It's good for, say, like a dual wielding Barbarian or something like that. And Great Weapon Master is another one of that fits this category. So when you attack with a melee weapon and it lands a crit or kills a creature, you can make another weapon attack as a bonus action that turn. So for classes that have, say, like a fighter or a barbarian or even a paladin that have an extra attack, let's say that you use those 2 attacks, you kill something, then you, as a bonus action, you can make a 3rd attack on top of that, right? And with that same feat, with a -5 to your attack rolls, you can also just increase the damage of that attack by 10, and you can't really go wrong with just increasing your overall weapon damage. So definitely pick up something that's relevant to the weapon you're using, or something like Savage Attack. Melee ranged options. Now there's a couple here, but the main one that I would absolutely pick up for anyone using any sort of a ranged weapon like this is Sharpshooter. So your ranged weapon attacks are not penalized by high ground rules, meaning you can attack from the low ground without penalty, and you can toggle on the passive all in. So your ranged weapon attacks get a -5 penalty to their attack rolls, but you deal an additional 10 damage. This is fantastic for ranged characters because a lot of the times you will actually be attacking from high ground, giving you some sort of an advantage, or even from stealth in a rogue's case, again, giving you advantage on that attack roll. So even though you're losing -5 on both of those 2 dice that you roll for an advantage like that, you still have a much higher chance of actually hitting and then just getting 10 damage for free, because chances are while you're, hidden and sneaking and in high ground, you're definitely going to hit that shot anyway, so it's just free damage. You could also consider something like mobile, so your movement speed is increased by 3 meters when you use the dash action as well. Difficult terrain doesn't slow you down, and if you move after making a melee attack, you don't provoke an opportunity attack from that target. So say if a creature is like within your melee attack range, let's say you're dual wielding daggers or something like that, you could use an offhand attack on them, and then you can move out of their range without triggering that opportunity attack if you want to say get away from them, so then you can use your actual weapon in those sort of instances. There isn't heaps of like ranged weapon specific options like this, but there's one more that I would consider, but we're going to talk about that in the spellcasting section as well, because I think it's relevant for both. But so talking about those spellcasters, the best overall here is probably going to be Elemental Adept. So your spells gain resistance to a damage type of your choice, and when you cast spells of that type, you cannot roll a 1. And the options here are Acid, Cold, Lightning, Fire, and Thunder. Fire is definitely the easiest one to get off because there's so many good fire spells in the game, like Firebolt, Fireball, Scorching Ray, etc. There's plenty of good options there. There is in the other categories as well. It's just I find fire to be the most consistent. But the benefit here not only is that you cannot roll a 1, so you'll always do slightly more damage, but also the fact that it gets rid of the resistance of that from the enemy. So say if an enemy is resistant to fire damage, you can still actually use fire damage on that target and still get a solid amount of damage on that. Plus you can't roll a 1 on that damage, so it's still beneficial there. This is really good just so you can consistently get damage off, especially of a specific type, because can't tell you how many times in this game like you use a spell on an enemy of a specific element and it does like no damage, and then you check the examine, you're like, oh, they're immune to that type, or oh, they take less damage, right? This really helps with things like that. It also helps just not only with your consistency of damage, but say if you're built for a specific damage type, like you're using armor and stuff that gives you benefits to a specific damage type, that also helps for that as well. Spell Sniper is another good option, so you can learn a cantrip here, which if you don't have it, you should absolutely pick up Eldritch Blast, and the number you need to roll a critical hit while attacking with spells is reduced by 1. So if you roll a 19 or a 20, you'll then actually critically hit that target. So you get benefits from that, plus an additional cantrip, which can be beneficial, say if you are a wizard or a sorcerer or something and you want to pick up Eldritch Blast in that sort of a way. Another common option that spellcasters look at is the Mage Initiates. Now these are okay. Essentially what this gives you is a couple of cantrips and a spell from a different spellcasting class here. But the one thing to consider here is that the spell that you do cast and the cantrips will actually be using whatever that class's spellcasting modifier is. Say for example, if you're a wizard and your spellcasting modifier is intelligence and you've maxed out your intelligence, and you pick up say like a bard spell or something, it's going to use charisma as its spellcasting modifier. It won't actually change to intelligence, so you won't actually get as much benefit from that spell. You're basically better off multi-classing into that class than using the Mage Initiates unless there's something specific you're looking for. But in most cases, I probably wouldn't recommend using the Mage Initiates unless you're one of those classes like say a bard that has a matching charisma spellcasting modifier with a warlock. So maybe you'll go into the warlock line to pick up Eldritch Blast or some other spells in that line as your feat option. But it just sort of depends. It's just worth noting that if there is something specific you want, just pay attention to the spellcasting modifier. Now the one that I wanted to mention that is in both the melee and the spellcasting is Alert. So you gain a +5 bonus to initiative and you can't be surprised. Now this is good sort of for like any class really, but it's really good for those classes that have a low HP and a low armor class, because you can sort of get destroyed in a single turn if you are ambushed and surprised. And also even if you're not surprised, right, if you just start a combat encounter and your mage is like in the middle of all the enemies, they're going to attack them first, especially if they're like your main talker, because they're like the player character. So getting that extra bonus 5 to initiative means you can not only attack first, but get out of the way first. And then you also can't be surprised, so you won't actually be snuck up on. So firstly, let's talk about how to multi-class. So anytime you're on the level up screen, in the top right of that window, you'll see an add class option. And by here, you can just add any class that you haven't already added, and you will gain the first level of that specific class. So from then on, anytime you level up, you'll be able to pick between those classes and choose which one you want to level up. You'll only gain a level in the class that you specifically choose. Now, because of how complicated this is, and that when you level up, you don't necessarily gain a level in both of the classes, you have to pick which one you're leveling up. There is a lot of careful consideration that needs to go into why you're multi-classing and the reasons, and because also there is no restrictions in Baldurs Gate 3. Larian have removed the D&D specific restrictions for multi-classing, so here you can just do literally anything you want. But I guess the caveat to that is that you can always respec at Withers for the cost of 100 gold. If say you've messed up, you can just nick back there and respec your class and just start again. But let's go through the major tips and consideration you need to think of. There's 3 things I think to put into this category. The first is the level breakpoints, the second is the spells, casting and slots, and the third is proficiencies. So by level breakpoints, what I mean here is that the main consideration really should be for multi-classing, you're essentially at the top of things, locking yourself out of level 12. So whatever your main class is, you'll never get to level 12 being the max level. And also the level you gain your final feat as well at level 12, you're locking yourself out of that. But you, in turn, if you multi-class at weird points, you'll also lock yourself out of class features. Because let's say, for example, with some of the martial classes like the barbarian, the fighter, the paladin, or the monk, they all gain a extra attack at level 5, right? Say if you multi-class at level 4, into something else and never take another level of any of those martial classes, you're missing out on a core element of that class because you multi-classed one level early and you never took that level 5 in that martial class to gain that benefit, which is a huge benefit for those classes. I should mention as well, the ranger also gains an extra attack at level 5. The next is the spell casting slots. So spell casting modifiers are different for certain classes. So for example, it may sound fun to be like a sorcerer with meta magic and then add a wizard to get like that massive spell pool that wizards have. But they have different spell casting modifiers, meaning sorcerer spells will be cast using charisma and wizard spells will be cast using intelligence. And this can in turn be very confusing because they have an overlapping spell pool in terms of the spells that they could use. But depending on whether you took those spells as either a sorcerer or a wizard, it will use those as your spell casting modifier, which in turn means that your ability point spread will be stretched pretty thin if you're trying to balance both of those spell casting modifiers. And on top of that, you also won't gain spell slots in the same way. So, you know, just like you won't gain the level 12 feat, you also have different breakpoints in terms of when you gain different spell slots depending on the classes that you're multi-classing with, and that'll then change that as well. And on top of that, each class has its own section in the spell book, so they don't share spells. So if you are using the sorcerer and wizard example again, sorcerer spells can't prepare their spells, whereas a wizard can. So wizards can actually use this menu still to prepare spells, but your sorcerer spells will always be prepared. And on top of that, some classes just aren't built to be spellcasters. Like the barbarian, for example, cannot cast spells while raging, which makes it not a great class to multi-class with for a lot of these classes that are very spell orientated. I know that's a lot of information and it's a little complex, but I've tried to make it simple, but we'll go through some specific spell like builds and stuff in a little bit. But firstly, proficiencies. So classes gain proficiencies inherently, like when you pick them just at character creation, as well as when you're multi-classing. But some of them won't always gain the same amount of proficiencies that you might get, say, when you create them at character creation. A good example of this is the fighter. When at character creation, you will gain heavy armor proficiency as your default class, but if you multi-class from a wizard, say, to a fighter, you won't gain that heavy armor proficiency. You'll still gain light and medium armor, but just not heavy. So just pay attention to that. But also, if you already have proficiency in something, like let's say if you're multi-classing from a barbarian and adding a fighter, you've probably got most of those proficiencies anyway, except the armor ones, so it doesn't matter that much in terms of proficiencies. So I wouldn't consider multi-classing just for proficiencies unless it's a very specific build you're going for. But as mentioned, if you mess up, just go back to Withers and respec and it is a-okay. But if I haven't turned you off multi-classing with all of this nonsense, let's go through some of the best multi-classing options. So keep in mind here that you can do whatever you like, right? Like these are just some simple options that I wanted to sort of cover for anyone that's considering dabbling in multi-classing, as it is very fun and there's a lot of cool, like unique things you can do with it. And just because of the freedom with Withers and being able to respec anytime you like, you can definitely change things. So we'll start with the Stealth God Rogue Ranger. Now this is a great pairing because they are both dexterity based classes. You could do something funky with strength if you wanted to, but using Astarion as an example here, I would get Astarion's Rogue to say level 4 and grab Assassin, and then get into Gloomstalker Ranger and get that to max level being 8 that you can there. Because these two pair so well, as the Assassin being the stealth orientated class for the Rogue, and the benefits you gain not only to your initiative but also to actually attacking from stealth, and the Gloomstalker is essentially the Ranger's version of this, where on the first turn of every combat encounter you gain an extra attack that does additional damage. So you attack from stealth and then you can also deal like stealth attacks from there, and then once that combat encounter starts you've got the access to the Dread Ambusher. So plenty of synergies there. Plus when you multi-class these classes together, whether you're starting as a Ranger or a Rogue, you get additional skills because one, each class will gain additional skills, especially the Ranger with Favored Enemy and Natural Explorer, the benefits you get from there. But also as a Rogue you get expertise in 2 skills as well, so they're great skill combos to combine together. Plus also, if we're thinking about breakpoints here, the Ranger does gain an extra attack at level 5, which is something the Rogue doesn't. So you've got that additional benefit by combining these 2 classes. The next I'm just going to call charisma combos, because there's a lot of charisma classes that can all sort of mesh together. I wouldn't do this like all of them together in one build, but you can combine them in interesting ways, right? So that would be the Paladin, the Bard, the Warlock, and the Sorcerer. These 4 classes all share charisma as their spellcasting modifier, which not only makes them good talkers for, say, like, you know, being the player character to pass a lot of spell checks, they also combine simply together because they all have that as their spellcasting modifier, and they are spellcasting classes, but then that varies a little bit in terms of what that means. So to give you a couple of examples here, you could combine a Paladin with a Bard. At level 2 as a Paladin, you gain Divine Smite, which is honestly the main reason you would go a Paladin, because of the extra radiant damage you get from those attacks. At level 5, you get that extra attack. And then if you combine it with a Bard, you can pick a subclass at level 3 and then gain the benefits there from either going Lore to lean more into spellcasting, potentially go Swords to get those extra sword flourish attacks, or something like that. But that's an option to combine, plus the extra skills you get as a Bard. You could definitely go Warlock and Sorcerer together, as that's a combo that everyone has talked about before, and it's a fantastic combination because the Warlock is lacking in spell casting elements, but you definitely want to be a spellcaster as a Warlock, and combining with the Sorcerer gives you that. Plus, because they're matching charisma modifier, you get access to Eldritch Blast plus the benefits you get from it. If you're combining these 2 classes, I would be getting the Warlock to at least level 2 to get the Eldritch invocations, so you can buff your Eldritch Blast, and obviously Sorcerer to at least level 2 as well for meta magic and the sorcery points, which is the main reason you play a Sorcerer as well. But both those classes pick their subclass at level 1, so you'll get that initially just by going that class. I'm calling this the Battle Mage, and it is a wizard and a fighter because, for one, I wanted to put every single class on this list, and the wizard is a weird one because they don't share a spellcasting modifier with any other spellcasting class. Because that is intelligence for them, you could consider pairing it with, say, like a level 3 Eldritch Fighter or a level 3 Arcane Trickster, because the Arcane Trickster does share an int modifier with the wizard, but it sort of fits weirdly. Like if you're looking to multi-class as a wizard, you're probably considering picking up something like a fighter for the proficiencies more than anything else. So those proficiencies allowing you to wear light or medium armor while you're actually still able to cast spells to increase your overall armor class, just to make you a bit more tanky. And you could get into melee range then if you wanted, because you've also got some weapon proficiencies from combining it with the fighter. A couple of things to consider here if you're making this sort of a combination. Fighter gains an extra attack at level 5 and an extra feat at level 6 if you want to go more the fighter route than wizard, and the wizard gains its school or its subclass at level 2, and then it gains level 3 spells at level 5, level 4 spells at level 7, level 5 spells at level 9, and level 6 spells at level 11. So those different like higher level spells that you obviously will want to be using as a wizard, just keep that in mind when you're sort of balancing those two classes together, that you probably, if you want to go in the spell casting route, you definitely only want to pick up say 1 or 2 levels of the fighter and then stack the wizard, because the spell casting element is still your main sort of goal there. Nature's Demon is a druid and cleric combination. Now they share the wisdom as their spell casting modifier. Combining these two classes allows you to use Shillelagh as a cleric, which will add that bludgeoning damage to your melee weapons as a cleric, which is great. You could also go something like a war domain cleric for the martial weapon proficiencies here. The druid isn't a great multi-class option again, because it is a really unique class, being that it's got so much going for it on its own. It's sort of like a multi-classed class on its own, right? Like there are so many different ways that you can take the druid, whether you're going a spell casting route, maybe a little bit of melee route with Shillelagh, potentially wild shaping, or necromancy. There's a lot going for it anyway, but just to give you a bit of an option here, if you are a druid or a cleric, you can combine these two to give your cleric wild shape or give your druid some more proficiencies and maybe a bit more melee prowess. You've got options there as well. The Berserker Barbarian Fighter is probably the best option for a Barbarian, because the Barbarian, as mentioned earlier, isn't a great multi-class option because you cannot cast spells when you are raged. So combining it with something like a fighter, especially like a champion fighter that's a very sort of simple subclass, is a perfect combination here, because fighters gain action surge, which essentially gives you another action so you can attack again, and second wind, which is something that barbarians severely lack, is a way to heal themselves, which second wind will allow them to do so. Keep in mind here that the barbarian and the fighter gain an extra attack at level 5. If you are a level 5 barbarian and a level 5 fighter, you won't gain an extra attack. You'll only get that extra attack once. And worth pointing out here as well, both the barbarian and the fighter pick their subclass at level 3, so you want to make sure you get both of those to level 3 so you can pick a subclass. For the barbarian, I would either be going the berserker or wild heart, depends on what you sort of prefer there, and fighter probably champion, though you could dabble in battle master. The fighter class also gains an extra feat at level 6, so if you're worried about say missing that feat you get from level 12, if you get your fighter to level 6, you'll still gain that feat as well. Lastly on this list is the healing monk. Now again, the monk is a weird class to multi-class with. It has such a good martial kit based around it. It also doesn't want to wear armor, a bit like the barbarian, and as a monk you don't really want to use weapons either, so like multi-classing as a monk is a bit weird. You could maybe combine it with a cleric to give yourself some say healing properties for yourself and your allies, because monks will use wisdom not only for their unarmored defense to increase their armor class, but also for their spellcasting modifier for the spells if they go the 4 elements route. Potentially you could then combine it with a cleric to give yourself some more weapon proficiencies if you do make weapon attacks, and maybe a shield, but I also wouldn't be wearing armor in that case. But it's not clean. I'm not telling you this is going to be a great build. I just wanted to include something for the monk because I've included something for every other class. So just to give you monk lovers out there an option, things to consider here is that monks gain a subclass at level 3 and an extra attack at level 5. So just make sure you're hitting those breakpoints as the monk, and then before you'll say picking up the cleric. But the monk is definitely a hard class to multi-class, but you can combine it with something like a fighter or even a thief to add additional actions and bonus actions to outweigh the fact that you have a little bit less key points because you are multi-classing. I've done this in a build video, which I will link here for you guys if you want to go watch that build if you want to try something else for the monk. Start with one of the most common annoyances, I think, or at least for me, and that's inventory management. So you're going to pick up a ton of things in this game. There's just constantly things to pick up, and you're going to be moving it between all of your characters and just like make sure you're not over encumbered and all that stuff. One of the really good tips, like the best tip across the board, is that things like your keys that you pick up or any food and supplies, as well as any alchemy items, will automatically go into the keychain, the supply pack, and the alchemy pouch. However, this doesn't always happen, and sometimes they can get like pulled out because of various quests, or they just like don't happen. What you can actually do is move a keychain, the supply pack, or the alchemy pouch into a inventory, and it will automatically scoop up any of those items that within that inventory and put them into that pouch. Now this only works for these 3 specific things. So supply pack for all of your, your supply items that you would use for your long resting, so all the food and everything. Keys are obviously for keys, and alchemy pouches for all of your alchemy stuff. The alchemy one is definitely one of the better ones that this works for, because you'll pick up a ton of like herbs and everything throughout the playthrough, and being able to scoop these up into a pouch very easily is super valuable. Something else to point out as well is that any of like your camp supplies that go into like that supply pouch, that they should actually just go into your traveler's chest, because your traveler's chest will be accessed when you go to long rest. So anything that's there, so you don't have to actually carry all of that extra weight, and they can be pretty heavy, especially all the food items and stuff when you've got heaps with you. So putting them in your traveler's chest is a good way to not have to sort of worry about that whole process. You can also like pick up the containers that you find, like say backpacks or any sort of pouches you find throughout the world. Sometimes you can just like pick them up and just use them as carrying containers. I like to do this for things like scrolls and that sort of a thing, because they just take up a lot of space in your inventory. It would just be nice if, they didn't for one, but you can sort of put them all into like one backpack and like whack them on Gale or something like that, just so you don't have to carry them and see them all of the time. You can also pick up chests and store them at your camp. Say for example, if you are out of lockpicks or you just like fail the check on everyone, you can just pick up the chest and send it to your camp and do a very similar thing, right? You can just then pull it out at your camp and then be able to actually lockpick it. And in this way, you may have also noticed that your traveler's chest has unlimited carry weight. So you can just fill that bad boy up with everything that you don't necessarily need to carry on you. So any armor, weapons, supplies, etc., you can just dump it in there. And speaking of that carry weight, if you press tab, you'll be able to bring up everyone's inventory together. It's just a great way to manage your inventory when you are on PC, so you can move things between them. Now, you don't actually have to move something into a companion's inventory in order to actually like use it, right? If you have someone else selected, you can actually still use something from someone else's inventory. Just pay attention to the name that it says in brackets, right? Like say if you're trying to secret potion or something like that. And if you click the equipped symbol on the inventory screen, you can actually see all of the items that can be equipped into that specific slot. So you don't have to hunt through your inventory list to try and find specific things. This doesn't include inactive companions or your camp chest. Like this should absolutely include your camp chest though, right? Larian, you listening? Please make this include your camp chest. Like I don't want to have to carry 20 pieces of armor around just because I like to change my build every day. But this is like super helpful, right? So I use this all the time when I'm trying to like figure out what I want to use for my builds. I essentially just like put everything that I have on all of my companions and then figure out what sort of equipment I want to use, and that's like the best thing to do. With patch 5 that launched literally the day after I recorded this video, you can now access your companions' inventories without needing to first add them to your party. There's a new camp companions option in the bottom left when you're at camp. Now this will only allow you to equip and move items from their inventory, but it doesn't change what I mentioned earlier in that when you're looking at those equip slots, you won't actually see items from your inactive party members or your traveler's chest in the equip slots. Baby steps, right? Let's move on to another massive topic, and that's these hidden buffs. And it's really all comes down to these like ritual spells and this concept of like camp casters. So every day that you go out, you've got a bunch of companions that just stay at your camp, and it's important that you can actually use them, right? Like there's no reason why you can't equip them into your active party for a brief amount of time to say use certain spells that last until your next long rest. What I would highly recommend to do is go to Withers and grab a hireling that's either a cleric or a wizard, and then multiclass them into the other one, especially a transmutation wizard, and we'll cover why in a little bit. But when you do this, you'll be able to pick up these ritual spells. Now the main one here is really Long Strider to increase your movement speed by 3 meters until your next long rest, but you can also grab Aid to give you temporary HP, and when you upcast Aid, you'll get more temp HP, so the further you get into the game, this still becomes valuable, and it's just like free HP, right? And because you're doing this on someone that's going to stay at your camp, you're not wasting any spell slots for that, right? So you can do that in that way. So anything that has that until long rest, like it lasts for that long and isn't a concentration spell, you'll be able to use that. And then once you remove that party member from your active party, it doesn't matter because it's still being cast and it's not a concentration spell. You can do this with other things, like there are other ritual spells like Featherfall and Enhanced Leap and stuff, but they don't last until long rest, so they're not as useful. But say if you need them, you can have someone at your camp that you could quickly switch in and out of your party to use. Even dialogue spells like Speak to the Dead or Speak with Animals, Detect Thoughts, those sort of spells as well. Having a cleric and a wizard sort of combo combo for this is best because you get aid from the cleric line plus a few other spells there, as well as the wizard picks up all the other ritual spells. But the main reason you want to go the transmutation wizard is because of their class feature that will allow you to craft 2 potions instead of 1 with alchemy when you pass a medicine check. Now this is really valuable because when we talk about potions, our next topic, there are some absolutely insane potions that just give you so much value in terms of buffs, right? Like you can obviously do things like make grenades and that sort of a thing, but the main benefits here in the early game would be the potion of speed, which is essentially a free win condition. Not only does it give you free movement speed, it also gives you an additional action in combat, right? So we've talked about in a lot of my multi-class builds about how attacking multiple times per turn is just super valuable. Now with the potion of speed, it gives you an extra action to use, so it's essentially a free action surge every turn while it lasts. Now once it does expire, you'll get lethargic, which does have its own debuffs, but you get this benefit very easy, and but most times like these encounters end before that effect wears out. Alternatively, as you get further in the game, you've got bloodlust, which is like even better. So when you defeat an enemy, you get a temporary HP bonus as well as another action for that turn, right? So if you in like the later games when we're talking about these builds where you can attack like 8 times per turn with 1 action, right? You are obviously going to defeat an enemy in that turn. If you focus fire on someone, then you get another action and then you can just, attack another 8 times, right? Like these potions are absolutely incredible, and they're just a couple of them, right? Like there's bark skin to increase your armor class and plenty of others that just do these really valuable things. So alchemy is something to not be slept on, right? It was only added with the full release of the game, and it's absolutely beneficial to use for crafting these sort of amazing benefits that really help with some of those late game bosses. So highly recommend. Another fun tip is about passives and their general like willingness to make things better. So one thing to think of, right, is non-lethal attacks. Now you can do this and enable this to knock out enemies rather than actually killing them. You have to like knock them out with martial weapons. You can't like knock them out by smacking them in the face with, a fireball or something, right? That doesn't really work. But if you knock enemies out, they will still survive those attacks, which in some scenarios is actually beneficial. There are certain boss encounters as well as different outcomes to quests that this is important for, which I won't spoil, but just, be thinking about that if something is important that you say, no, don't kill me for whatever reason. But there are other reasons to use passives as well, right? Like you can turn off weapons that have lights. Like some weapons just have like a massive light on them. This makes stealth really hard because it's literally a light coming out of your weapon, and in your passives you can turn this off and you can see that this actually changes how obscured you are like when you're stealth. There are other buffs and like class specific features as well that will show up in here that you'll often get as you level out your classes with your class features. So just important to remember that you have that passives tab and be thinking about that as you're entering in boss fights and encounters, because in some cases like some of the monk class features, you can just get like free damage from enabling certain passives, so just consider that as well. With all of that gear in your inventory, you will spend a ton of time talking to vendors. Now there's a few important things to remember here. When you start a conversation with a vendor, the prices will be calculated based off the character that you start that conversation with, and not only their attitude with that specific character, but also their charisma stat. So in this example here, you can see when I'm talking to this vendor with Will that his charisma is obviously a lot higher than Astarian's, and you can see the price difference for this longbow is significantly different. Even though they have different attitudes as well, you can see that that stat difference, just because of that charisma difference, is also different as well. You can increase their attitude towards you by selling items for less than they're worth, or just giving them items for free, and then that does calculate into getting you items back in terms of bartering for like less. But for the most part, you'll be moving through the game at a rate that you don't necessarily need to do this. Like I would really just be talking to people with your highest charisma stat, and if that fails, you can just steal their inventories, right? Like if you have a character that's quite stealthy, you can stealth behind them and steal anything that you like. And if you're also wanting to sell more items, vendors gold does refresh when you either level up or you long rest, and their gold level will refresh. Combat is the last key part of Baldur's Gate we haven't really touched on. Now one of the key things to remember is surface synergies. So if there's water on the ground, you can electrify it. My Storm Warden multi-class is absolutely brilliant for this, so go and check out that video. You can also put things on the ground like grease or oil and set them ablaze. Speaking of putting grease on oil on the ground, if you have a backpack in your inventory, speaking of the method we talked about earlier, how you can carry backpacks, you can put explosives and bombs and all that stuff in them, throw the backpack, and it will throw all of those items at once, so you don't have to throw them individually. And then with, say, just hitting them with one sort of ranged attack, you can actually activate all of those effects at once. Now this doesn't do heaps of damage, right? It sounds like it should do like a massive amount of damage and explosions and all that kind of stuff, and it does do that. Like putting grease and fire in there is obviously great because you can create like a fire hazard on the ground. But if you have a lot of bombs and grenades that apply status effects, you can do this to apply all of those status effects at once. So it's a great like fight start opener, so you can apply those status effects to everything sort of in that surrounding area and then attack from there. Also, high ground is obviously amazing for ranged characters. It's always valuable. You can create your own high ground by stacking crates and climbing on top of them. Don't forget to examine enemies all of the time. It's one of the best things you should do in every combat encounter, because basically every enemy has some sort of resistance and you won't know about it unless you use the examine feature. So obviously use that. It'll help you decide what types of damage to use against them, what type of spells to use, and it will explain any of the unique buffs that any of these like unique enemies may have. So make sure you're right clicking and examining on all of these enemies. Larian have been regularly updating the game since launch with a number of patches that have come out, and they've actually added valuable things for you to think about if you're returning to Baldur's Gate or even playing for the first time. One of them is that there is a magic mirror at every single camp. This can be a little bit hidden, so make sure you're looking for it either on the map or just like running around to find it. This will allow you to change your appearance. Now you can't change any of your race or any of that stuff because it's all linked to, you know, the role-playing aspects, but you can just like tweak your appearance here if you wanted to. You can also do this for hirelings as well, which is a massive buff that you can now actually change these hirelings so they can look a certain way. If you want to do that, you can also change their name there as well. Patch 5 also added a brand new epilogue with over 3,000 additional recorded lines that occurs 6 months after the main events from the game, where you can catch up with your companions and other people that you've met across your journey and find out what's been happening with them. This is in itself worth another playthrough or just booting up an old save to check it out, honestly, to see these different variations that can happen here. But this is a massive addition to Baldur's Gate 3 well after the launch, just for free. Like, it's huge. And there has been just an insane amount of bug fixes and like dialogue fixes and just new scenes and corrections being added. Like, there's been a lot of new scenes and changes to, say, Karlak and Minthara, the two companions. They've had plenty of fixes and changes as well. So this and everything else that's been added to the game is absolutely huge, right? There's too much to go through, and I wouldn't recommend reading all the patch notes because there is a lot there. But, you know, if you are returning to the game, you will notice some changes and things that have been updated. Still want more? I have a class guide for every single class, multi-class builds, plus much more on the channel, which I'll link here. So thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.